It's great to be with all of you today. So Vivek put me last because, of course, my talk has the potential to be the most technical, and we all want to have technical talks at this time of the day, right at noon. But it won't be technical. But I'm going to still try something a little new. It's some subtle concepts, and I would like to see how you guys react to this. And this will be the first time I've tried to explain some of this. And my thinking actually is evolving as I think about it. So you'll help me as well. Okay, I have a bunch of icons on this slide. We're very fortunate. We've been fortunate to run our online decision algorithms in a variety of trials. I think Peja spoke with you about heart steps. We had 2 algorithms running in several of the heart steps trials. We had an algorithm running in the Sense to Stop trial. This was a smoking cessation trial. Vivek and I are we're in the pilot phase with an algorithm running in the Oralytics trial. And we'll have an algorithm in MyWaves, which is Oralytics is for people who are working to improve their dental health, involves a sensor-enabled toothbrush. And MyWaves, these are adolescents and young adults who are smoking too much pot, too much cannabis, and they're starting to have problems. It's to try and help them reduce their cannabis use. In all of these cases, we're running these types of algorithms. Okay, so what are my goals? And in some sense, this is akin to an outline for the talk. I want to show one way to operationalize how one can think about real-time personalization in mobile health. And then I'm going to talk this is the second bullet point. I want to discuss these different ways to view these decision-making algorithms. And this is the point, I said I was going to do something different for me. This is the first time I've tried to explain this. And again, my thinking is evolving. It'd be very interesting to hear your viewpoint. And in the second half of the talk, we'll learn about one particular type of decision-making algorithm, reinforcement learning. It turns out these algorithms, if you think about them in certain ways, they're actually not that complicated. And you don't have to have a mathematical or computer science degree to be able to critique them. And I want to be able to provide that type of reassurance here and show you how you might think about them. And then I have, at the very end, I'll close with some critical take-home points when you're thinking about collaborations. Okay. When is it? So when you think about personalizing a mobile health intervention, some of the questions you're asking in your mind, when is it most useful for this device, say a smartphone, a tracker on your wrist, to initiate contact with the individual to attempt to provide support? For example, in the case of heart steps, it might be provide ideas for how you can be more active in the moment. And so when should you even do this? When would it be useful? And sometimes it might be useful, sometimes it might not. You want to understand that. Should the type of support vary based on the person's current state? For example, suppose it's on a weekend, Saturday morning, and the weather is pretty good. Is it worthwhile to send these ideas for how they can be more active in the moment? Maybe or maybe not. And answering these questions is all about personalizing the delivery or the type of intervention that you provide via mobile health. Now, there's some 2 second questions at the very bottom, and this is where things get more tricky. So you might ask, well, do these questions change as a person's experience with the digital intervention grows, or as their life circumstances change? For example, if a person begins to become self-identify more and more as a physically active person, perhaps their responsivity to support about how they can be more active in the moment will change over time within that person. Another thing that might happen is the answers to these two first questions might be different from one person to the next. For example, it may be that some people, you have a whole group of people, it's Saturday morning, the weather's good, but some people, for whatever reason, maybe it's because their family structure is not conducive to exercising in the moment, will not be responsive to physical activity support at that time, whereas others will. So you have this differing between people differences, as well as the former, which was within a person across time differences, and how you might address these two questions. Okay, okay. So there's two kind of scenarios in which you would think about these questions. One scenario is where you feel, because of the sensors you have available, as well as your understanding knowledge of the type of behavioral support you want to provide, you feel that you have observed, you're able to observe most of the reasons why someone's experience, their responsivity or the answers to the two top bullet points might vary across time within a person. Or you might have enough sensor data, enough observations, so that you might be able to address the second question: why would one person appear to be more responsive in a particular setting than another person? So this between person variability and the within person variability and how you would address these two questions, you might be able to explain by getting the right kind of data, and you're able to get that data. It's not too burdensome. It's possible to get it. So that's one kind of scenario that you might be in. And I think in some settings in digital intervention space, we are in this setting. And this is the kind of setting in where you might think, well, if I'm going to use a decision-making algorithm, I'll use it more as part of a trial design. And within this trial design, and we called them, Pedja and Walter this morning called these micro-randomized trials, we would use this decision-making algorithm to alter the randomization probabilities of, say, sending an activity suggestion versus not. And in fact, I say this in the bottom bullet point. So one way to think about personalization is if the algorithm notices that detects that the person's data indicates that that person is more responsive to a type of suggestion when they're in a particular state, say Saturday morning when the weather's good, then the algorithm will deliver that type of suggestion with higher probability. So that's what we mean by personalization here, is the algorithm learns about the person from their data. The data is sufficiently complete, and it can learn that then in that particular state, for example, on a Saturday morning when the weather's pretty good, the person's likely to be responsive, and thus it's worthwhile sending the suggestion. So I'm just reiterating. So this is one role that we see for online decision-making algorithms. That this first role is part of the design of the experiment, design of a clinical trial. I think perhaps you guys learned about optimization experiments or optimization trials, and this would be part of the design of such a trial, in our case, a micro-randomized trial. So this algorithm does conduct the randomization, and it increases the probability or decreases the probability depending on the responsivity of the individual to the suggestions. In this case, you might have a series of trials where you're trying to build up your just-in-time adaptive intervention. You'd have a bunch of different types of analyses. You might be interested in different types of outcomes, say outcomes related to burden, how much treatment burden you're placing on the individual, and so on. And after this series of trials, usually optimization type trials, you and your team, your entire team, y'all would construct your just-in-time adaptive intervention, your JEDI. And then you might move to a confirmatory two-arm trial. One arm would include the JEDI component. The other arm would include an appropriate comparison. If that was successful, you might move to implementation in a healthcare system. And like people it's discussed with Petra before, certain of these stages might be skipped, but then you have to be very careful that you're capturing all the potential effects. So in this case, your just-in-time adaptive intervention is a component of the mobile health intervention that you're built. You may have multiple components. You may have a self-monitoring component, and then you might have a JEDI, which is managing the activity suggestions. And they're just two different components, probably have a whole bunch in your mHealth intervention, and those go together to form your active arm in your randomized control trial. Now, in this setting, because I'm talking about constructing a JEDI, I'm actually, in a very subtle way, communicating something in particular. I'm communicating the fact that the decision rules that underpin the JEDI are static. What do I mean by static? That we're gonna form decision rules. These decision rules input the person's current state, time of day, for example, whether the weather's good, whether they're in a social environment or not, whether they're at work or office, and so on. It might be how engaged they've been in the intervention. You can imagine a whole variety of inputs to the decision rule, and it will output, this static JEDI will output whether or not to send some sort of support, such as an activity suggestion. I say static because once these decision rules are formed, they just go straight as is into the randomized control trial or into the implementation phase. There's this whole decision-making algorithm, that's gone now. You use the decision-making algorithm to conduct these. It's part of the experiments that you ran, but once you go to the two-arm study and hopefully to an implementation phase, you're done. You formed your decision rules, they're set, it's over, you're set. Okay, that's one way to think about online decision-making algorithms. And this way, their primary and their role is really about helping you design the experiment. So let's go back to our questions. I showed you this slide before, and with the first two bullet points being about the kinds of questions you might want to ask if you're interested in personalizing an intervention. And then the last two, addressing whether or not within a person across time, the answers to these two first questions might vary, perhaps because the person has begun to identify themselves as a physically active person, and now different types of interventions or different scheduling of the suggestions might be better, more useful for that person. Or you might have between a variation in how people might respond to these questions. People in the exact same setting, on the weekend, Saturday morning, weather's good, two different people respond very differently. Now, if you're able to collect, in the last part of the slides, I mentioned that we assumed that we're able to collect enough of the person's state, for example, whether or not they're now starting to self-identify as a physically active person, enough of their family structure to know that their family structure might not make it possible for them to respond on a weekend to activity suggestions. If you're able to collect that kind of information, these are going to be inputs to your JEDI decision rules. But suppose you're concerned that the answers to these questions may change in ways that you didn't anticipate, or you might have some idea about what kind of data you can collect, but it's just simply too burdensome to collect that data on an individual. This is the setting where it's either there's unknown data, unknown reasons why you should be changing your answers to these two first bullet points, or you have ideas about how you should do it, and you just can't observe those reasons. It's just simply too burdensome. The sensor technology is not there. It's too intrusive. Could be a variety of reasons. So this is a very different setting from the scenario I presented earlier. Now, here comes the second reason or second role that you might consider an online decision-making algorithm. Now, the decision-making algorithm becomes part of the treatment. It's no longer simply, you can still use it as part of the experimental design, but now it's a treatment component in your whole mHealth intervention. And we're calling this, we're just starting, this is the first time I've ever talked in public about this, but we're calling these PJEDIs, personalizing JEDIs. In this setting, you would have a series of trials, just like before, optimization studies. You do a variety of data analyses. The team would spend a lot of time brainstorming, and they might change the personalizing JEDI, the decision-making algorithm that's powering that personalizing JEDI, that PJEDI. Then they would, in the most idealistic case, they would conduct a 2-arm randomized trial. One arm would use the PJEDI component, which involves now a decision-making algorithm, in contrast to the first role. And indeed, if you move to the implementation phase, that decision-making algorithm is there as well. So I just restate all of this at the very bottom of the slide. The PJEDI is a component of your mHealth intervention. It appears in the active arm of the randomized controlled trial, and it would be part of, if everything went well in the randomized controlled trial, it would appear in the implementation phase. And why would you do this? It's because there's this information that you're not, either it's too burdensome to access, or you didn't even think about accessing. That means that you need to allow these decision rules to change either within a person across time or between people. So one person, again, think of those two people, or one person, their family situation simply just does not permit them to be very responsive to activity suggestions on the weekend, whereas another person, they can be responsive to activity suggestions on the weekend, but you, for whatever reason, that information, this attribute, the family situation, the family structure is not accessible. It hasn't been collected. So now you need a PJEDI which detects this, that one person can respond on the weekends and another person is, it's just not worth bothering them on the weekend. And the same within a person across time. Again, these are cases, because you're now talking about an algorithm that's as a part of the treatment, the JEDI decision rules evolve either between people or within a person. So now I have to get to my second component of the talk. And this component is, I just wanted to go through a specific decision-making algorithm that we actually used in Heart Steps, and talk you through it and see how you can think about it, conceptualize it, and realize that this is something you can critique. You can think about, you can play a role in formulating. Your expertise can be brought to bear in designing this decision-making algorithm. Vivek, should I pause right now and see if anybody has a question, like a clarifying question or something of that type, just to make sure?
I believe they will raise their hand if they have seek any clarifications. Absent that, you can keep going.
Okay, yeah, if we were in a classroom, see, this is when I get everybody to stand up and walk around, or in my case, I stand up and crutch around. Okay, we're going to go on. Okay, so we're on this third bullet point here. So Heart Steps, I think Pedja talked to you about Heart Steps. It was a series. Well, okay, now Heart Steps is being used all over the place, and these algorithms are all over the place. But I'm only going to talk about the first 3 studies. So the first 3 studies were about developing an activity coach for people who were at high risk of coronary artery disease, in particular, people who just got diagnosed with stage 1 hypertension, which, as you know, is a very unique time. Often when someone, not always, but often if you're diagnosed with stage 1 hypertension, sufficient behavior change can help you prevent having to go onto medication. So this is a great time to try and attempt to change your behavior. So Heart Steps had, I think it had 6 major intervention components, only one of which was this contextually tailored activity suggestion. So that's the one I'm going to focus on here, but it's very important to realize that these interventions are not simplistic. They don't just have one type of component. Often they're self-monitoring components and other intervention components. So in the case of the contextually tailored activity suggestions, there was one could send the suggestion or not. The content of the suggestion was always tailored to sensor data on the individual. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a little example. This one came to me in the morning on a work day, and it was very cold outside. So you can see how it's trying to get me to reframe how I'm thinking, and it gives me a suggestion that I can actuate right away because it's right before I'm going to work. These suggestions could be delivered to me. They occurred on your lock screen or your phone at any of 5 times per day. And they were times that depended on that individual's life, the way they, when they woke up, when they ate lunch, and so on. So they were user-specific times. And the content of these messages was intended to help the person be more active in the moment. So when you thought about whether or not these messages, delivering a contextually tailored activity suggestion versus not, you really thought a lot about, well, did it influence near-time physical activity? Here operationalized as one subsequent 30-minute step count. There was each of these individuals had both an app on the phone and a tracker, a commercial tracker that was observing step count. I already mentioned this first bullet point. The focus was this immediate impact on the subsequent 30 minutes. But of course, the underlying theoretical idea is that you would help that person build a whole repertoire of ideas for being more active in daily life. So one hopes to have delayed effects or longer term effects by helping that person build a repertoire of ideas. And of course, once you combine it with other intervention components, in addition, these people do have stage 1 hypertension. So we're also talking about visits to clinicians. You would hope that all of this together, you'll contribute to a reduction in heart attacks and other heart diseases. Now, these trials are micro-randomized trials. And as you know, this means that each user is randomized many times. And there were 5 times at which these contextually tailored suggestions might get delivered. So it was at each of these 5 times. And in particular, the second 2 studies used a decision-making algorithm to do that randomization. It was called, this decision-making algorithm was one in a class of algorithms called reinforcement learning algorithms. And these algorithms attempt to personalize as they learn from data. And remember, on a prior slide, I indicated one way that you can conceptualize personalization. So in the case here, that the algorithm assesses the amount of evidence in the data on that individual in favor of sending a suggestion, whether or not that suggestion is really helpful for that person in the person's current state. And if there's a lot of evidence, then with higher probability, the algorithm sends the message. If not, the algorithm does not bother the individual, or is less likely to bother the individual. At the bottom of the slide, you see this in blue, the adjective personalized study, micro-randomized personalized. And it's the personalized part that's indicating that we had an online algorithm, this reinforcement learning algorithm running in this study that was altering these probabilities up and down, depending on the accruing evidence in favor of sending a contextually tailored activity suggestion versus not. Now, in heart steps, there were actually 2 different components used, online decision-making algorithms. But we're going to focus on the second one, and that is the one that had to do with these contextually tailored activity suggestions. And the attempt by this algorithm was to learn what is the level of evidence at each time in favor in that person's current setting. Is it worthwhile? What's the evidence in favor of sending a suggestion in that current setting? Again, I've already said all of this. The reinforcement learning algorithm focused on this particular component, whether to deliver a message, a suggestion or not, at each of 5 user-specific time points. And the outcome the algorithm paid attention to was the near time physical activity as measured by step count for that individual. So these reinforcement learning algorithms, they always have 2 elements. Often when we're in a big interdisciplinary environment with engineers, computer scientists, people won't go into what these 2 elements are. But in general, they always have these 2 elements. And it's useful, I think, from a behavioral science perspective, to really, in your mind, to think about both of these elements. So the first element has a fancy name. It's called a learning algorithm. It sounds cool. And all it is a data analysis method. That's all it is. It may be a really sophisticated data analysis method, such as some sort of deep learning algorithm. Or it may be something so simple like a linear regression. This data analysis model is used to estimate this data analysis method is used to estimate parameters. In deep learning, they don't call them parameters, they call them weights. But it's the same thing. It's used to estimate the parameters in a model for the effect of the treatments on both proximal outcomes and more delayed effects of the treatments. So you think of a treatment at time t. In our case, in Heart Steps, it's whether or not to deliver a suggestion. The learning algorithm is going to produce some model. It's going to estimate parameters in this model to anticipate the effect of that treatment, both now and in future, if you provide it now versus if you don't provide it now. That's the first thing the algorithm does. This algorithm doesn't do any action. It's an internal algorithm that goes on inside the whole system, the decision-making process. The second part, which is called a treatment selection strategy, this is the part that really has the impact on the person. And this is the strategy for deciding whether or not to send the treatment. In our case, send a contextually tailored activity suggestion versus don't send a contextually tailored activity suggestion. And how is that treatment selection strategy formed? Well, from the learning algorithm, it obtains some measure of confidence in the estimation that's conducted by the learning algorithm. So if you're thinking of like linear regression, you can think confidence interval, a confidence interval for the effect of the treatment at that time. That would be a very simple measure of confidence that most of us are familiar with. In deep learning, there's other ways that one attempts to obtain measures of confidence in the output of the learning algorithm. And again, it's a measure of confidence in this estimate of the effect of the treatment at time t. If you're a Bayesian, it'll be related to the posterior distribution of the effect of the treatment at time t. So no matter what, this treatment selection strategy uses some measure of how confident the algorithm is in its estimation. And the more confident the algorithm is, then with greater chance the treatment selection strategy sends that contextually tailored activity suggestion. The less confident, the closer to 1/2 in our case, because we only have 2 treatments. Hey, Walter, I see you have a question.
I do, thank you. Oh, so I understand the treatment selection strategy piece, and I'm curious if you can you do this to like iterate across different potential treatments to determine which would be the best in a given moment?
Oh yeah, in Heart Steps, we only had binary well, that's not true. We actually had more. But in most cases, we actually have like 4 or 5 buckets of types of treatments. Like for example, sometimes you'll have a bucket of more positively framed messages, a bucket of negatively framed messages. Now, in Heart Steps, all of the messages are contextually tailored. So a person gets a message that's deemed appropriate for the setting they're in. It's just that sometimes they may be positive. It may have a positive framing. Sometimes they have a negative. One might be interested in that. Other times you may have different kinds of messages that have a more motivational aspect to them. So often you have more than 2 options, send versus not. You actually have like 4 options or 5 options, and those options are all buckets. And each bucket, the messages are contextually tailored to current sensor data. John, I see you have a question as well.
Yes, thank you. I'm still trying to comprehend the treatment selection strategy and the confidence of the model. So is the confidence gauged based off prior data, and it just uses that as a reference, and then it brings in whatever the context of the current participant and gauges it against that prior data?
Yeah, you're getting it. So like, let's say capital time T, little t here, time T. Let's say time T is 6 months out. By then, you've got a ton of data on that person. Now, if they're in a setting which they've been in many times, you've had a lot of, that algorithm's had a lot of experience in that setting. So the level of confidence might be pretty high. Whereas you could be out, say 6 months, but they're in a new state, a setting they haven't been in very often. And all of a sudden your confidence is not very high. So it really, and it's the confidence in whether or not it's worthwhile to send that treatment. You know, you don't just send a treatment willy-nilly, because these things that you're bothering people, you know, they're going about their life. People are going about their everyday life, and you're interrupting them. So you only want to send suggestions if they're really helpful to that individual. So the degree of evidence, so it really depends. Like if little t, time T is at the very beginning, there's not a lot of confidence in anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wait, I see a chat. Let me see what someone let me see what the person asked in the chat. Oh yeah, this is AI. Totally AI, man. Totally AI. That's another cool word. I could use AI instead of reinforcement learning, but reinforcement learning is also cool, so I figured I'd use that instead. I'm full of cool words. Okay, let me see if I can get this to move. So I just want to talk to you about the algorithm what I want to do is I want to help you delve a little bit more into this learning algorithm and this this treatment selection strategy. And I'm going to do it in a really simplistic way. And it's just to help me be clear. In real life, for example, in Heart Steps, it was not this simple, but I think all the ideas are there, and I'm able to be clearer by doing it this way. So if you think every time T, you have information on an individual. You have their current state, like in Heart Steps, we know their current location. We know how recently, their recent activity. We know how engaged they've been. You know, have they been self-monitoring themselves recently? We know how many times we bothered them in the recent past. We know a lot of things. The state has a lot of variables in it. And then that's capital S, and little t is that particular time. Capital A is just a treatment indicator in our case, because we're only choosing between delivering a contextually tailored activity suggestion versus not. In general, AT there might be 4 or 5 different, it just depends on the setting, how many different options there are. Here, it's just binary 2. And then you have some outcome that you feel that this treatment is targeting, and we call that a proximal outcome, and I'm denoting that by Y. And I use a subscript of T+1 just as a mnemonic to remember that occurs after a treatment decision is made at time T. So, little t goes from 1 to, like in the case of Heart Steps, V3, the last t was way over 1,000. So, little t, it just at each time t, you have a certain amount of data you've accumulated on each individual, and you see their state. The algorithm has to decide the treatment, and then an outcome is observed. So I want to give you a really simple learning algorithm. Of course, one wouldn't. I would not present this algorithm at a computer science conference. They would all laugh me out. but it has all the ideas in it. So I'm just doing simple linear regression. I have 4 parameters, alpha 0, alpha 1, beta 0, and beta 1. A is an indicator. A equal 1 means deliver the suggestion. A equals 0 means don't deliver the suggestion. The person's state S is just one-dimensional. You can think about their level of engagement. So they're either more engaged or less engaged up to this time. And you can see from this very simple linear regression that we're thinking that the state S, which is engagement, moderates the effect of the sending of the activity suggestion on the person's physical activity, their 30-minute step count. Now, the treatment effect model is the difference of this simple linear regression when you set A equal 1, i.e. send a suggestion, versus when you set A equals 0, don't send a suggestion. And so I took those difference and I just get the beta terms. It's very simple. There's only 2 parameters that have to be estimated. Beta 0 is the overall effect of sending a suggestion versus not. And beta 1 encodes the moderating effect of what, if the person's currently very engaged versus if the person is not very engaged, what's the effect of sending the suggestion. So very simple state here. It's not, it's simplistic, but helps me convey the ideas. So what does this learning algorithm do? The learning algorithm has to estimate these 2 parameters, the overall effect of sending a suggestion versus not, beta 0, and the moderating effect of engagement, beta 1. And it might put hats on those parameters. And here you might use a linear regression. And what data are you using to do your linear regression? Well, at time t, you have all the past data on that individual to use to estimate these 2 parameters. So if little t is big, you got a lot of data. If little t is small, you don't have so much data. The underlying, I'm just repeating myself here because I'm trying hard to be clear. So our treatment effect is that beta 0 plus beta 1. Now at time t, my current context is S sub t. So I had to replace S, capital S, by S sub t, because now I'm at time t, and that person is in a certain setting. They may be engaged right now at time t, or they may not be very engaged at time t. So my estimated treatment effect, now I use my estimated parameters, beta hat 0, beta hat 1. So how does the treatment selection strategy use? Well, it might get a confidence interval of this treatment effect based on the estimated treatment effect. And it might use this confidence interval to help decide whether or not there's sufficient promise to send an activity suggestion. Now, another way, and it's the way we used in Heart Steps, we used a Bayesian linear regression. So we're going to get a posterior distribution of this treatment effect. And the posterior distribution will help us, and I'll show you that later. But in both cases, the confidence interval will be wide if there's not a lot of evidence so far in favor of sending a suggestion. And in fact, the confidence interval might contain 0. Or the confidence interval or the Bayesian posterior distribution will be very flat, indicating there's just not a lot of confidence in your current estimate of the treatment effect. So how does this algorithm work? This algorithm is going on in real time. In the case of Heart Steps, it was on the cloud and it communicated back and forth with the app. So the algorithm observes the individual's current state. In our simple model, it's just whether they're currently engaged right now. The second element, the treatment selection strategy, selects a treatment, send an activity suggestion versus not. Then the algorithm sees whether or not the person was active, what their 30-minute step count is. Now the learning algorithm comes in, the other element of the whole package, and it updates your estimators and your confidence intervals, or if you're Bayesian, it updates the posterior distribution. But that update is based on not only the data you had prior to time t, but all this new data, this new data on the current state, the current treatment, and the current physical activity. So you can imagine that's just going through time, where at each time you have the selection strategy based on the amount of evidence so far, selects the treatment, And then the learning algorithm updates the estimators and updates the level of evidence that you have, level of confidence. So just to heart steps, this is the first round. I'll talk about heart steps, and then I'll make it slightly more complicated. So in heart steps, what we did in the second 2 trials, and actually this algorithm ran and is running in subsequent heart steps studies too, we built a Bayesian model. And that means you put prior distributions on that beta 0 and beta 1. We actually had more parameters, and you put a prior on this, and the prior is built using prior data from other individuals. And because it's a Bayesian algorithm, what it does is it updates the posterior distribution of the treatment effect as data accrues on the individual. Because we used a Bayesian regression model, it really fit in really nicely in terms of a treatment selection strategy. So what we do is we use the Bayesian linear regression model to form the posterior probability that the treatment effect of sending an activity suggestion in the current state is greater than 0. If that posterior probability is high, say like 0.8, then with probability 0.8, we'd send us an activity suggestion. If that posterior probability is low, say like 0.2, then we'd only send the suggestion with probability 0.2 because there just wasn't enough evidence in favor of sending that suggestion. However, in fact, it's a little bit more complicated, and I think this is a really important aspect that all of us. Okay, wait, I gotta see what Walter has to talk, and then I'll go to this slide. Hey, Walter.
Hi. So for example, with the step intervention, is it ever the case that for the algorithm ascribes somebody a low probability of a treatment being effective, and for whatever reason, maybe the person just hasn't responded in the past, it is almost always the system decides not to send them an intervention? At that point, are they just not receiving an intervention, or how is that handled?
No, well, it depends on the algorithm you choose. So the algorithm we built for heart steps, the algorithm will constantly probe at even if the evidence so far indicates that in that state, that person is unlikely to be responsive, the algorithm with a very low probability will probe constantly to see whether or not things have changed. And we do this because we're very concerned that we don't have the person's entire state. For example, they may have started identifying as a physically active person, and now things are different for them, or something happened. Their child now is starting to go to school and their circumstances have changed. And that's not part of the data we have at hand. So all of a sudden their responsivity has started to alter. So we always use some lower, even if the evidence is pretty low, we use some lower, a small probability, non-zero probability, to probe every now and then whether or not things have changed that individual.
Okay, that makes sense.
Similarly, even if the evidence is like totally overwhelming, that sending a suggestion in a particular state is just like the best thing, we won't send it with probability 1 because things could change and it might not be good to send it. So we will never send the suggestion with probability 1. Now, that's the particular algorithm we used in heart steps. This is an issue that one needs to be very thoughtful about because many algorithms don't follow that procedure. And you as a scientist, you have to be really aware of this. And I'll talk about that later on. I mean, this is a great question. So one of the challenges, and I think you guys know this better than me, particularly if you're in behavioral science, the big underlying problem in digital health and mobile health is habituation and burden. So, you're intervening as someone goes about their life, and repeated stimuli, people can habituate to repeated stimuli and just not even see the stimuli anymore. Or they can just really turn off and they just ignore you because it's a treatment burden. These are big delayed negative treatment effects. And they concern us a great deal because if people totally disengage, we can't help them when they need help. So we really want to decide whether or not to send an activity suggestion now, taking into account the potential for delayed negative effects. Of course, we're also hoping there's some delayed positive effects like forming healthy habits, but the big concern here is delayed negative effects. So in fact, in Heart Steps, what we did was the treatment selection strategy was altered. It was altered by that term in blue. We also estimated a delayed effect of sending a suggestion versus not. That in Heart Steps, that delayed effect was almost always negative. So what it did was it reduced the probability with which you would send a suggestion. If that delayed effect was really negative, it reduced the probability a lot. If it was not very negative, it didn't reduce it very much at all. So I just wanted to show you some results from some people in this study. Pedja mentioned that some of the Heart Step studies went on at Kaiser Permanente in Seattle, and this was an individual in one of those studies. The individual came into the study in mid-December 2019, and left the study in early August 2020. So this was an individual who went through the study through the beginning of the pandemic. You can see on the horizontal axis around late March, mid-March, that's when Seattle closed down. And indeed, their behavior seems a little different from before versus after. So on the vertical axis, the y-axis, this is the predicted effect of the activity suggestion. So this learning algorithm is predict in every, so there's essentially 5 dots per day. You can't see that because they're on top of each other. But at each time, the algorithm predicts whether or not the person is likely to be responsive to a contextually tailored activity suggestion. If the prediction is greater than 0, there's some evidence they might be. If the prediction is less than 0, there's not very much evidence at all. And we color-coded these dots for one of the state variables, which was engagement. It was a binary variable, and it had to do with whether or not you're monitoring your behavior in the app. So blue is you had been recently monitoring your behavior in the app. Red was you had not been monitoring your behavior, your physical activity that much. And you look at this and it's pretty glorious. At least I thought so, because the algorithm is noticing that when the person is engaged, it appears that the person is likely to be more responsive to an activity suggestion. And of course, these algorithms have a feedback loop because you're using the treatment selection strategy to choose the next action. And repeatedly, as data comes in, whenever the person's engaged, it looks like they're going to be more responsive. So I felt this, this is really striking. It's glorious. If you look at the probabilities with which the activity suggestions are being sent by the treatment selection strategy, it mirrors the last slide. When the person is engaged, you're getting higher probabilities. When the person is less engaged, you're getting lower. That's the red dot. You're getting lower probabilities. Notice these probabilities are always between 0.2 and 0.8. This is this continual probing that we were talking about. I was talking about with Walter earlier. So in the particular context of this study for this individual, what do we mean by personalization? Well, personalization means that learning algorithm is predicting the effect. That's the top slide that I showed you earlier. It's predicting that in the engaged states, the person's more likely to be responsive. So the treatment selection strategy, that's the lower figure, is sending the suggestion with higher probability, the blue dots. And when the person is less engaged, the learning algorithm is indicating they're less likely to be responsive, and thus the treatment selection strategy is sending the activity suggestion with lower probability. Okay, I'm going to skip this. This is another person. I'm skipping 2 slides. That was another setting. I just want to go on to this, back to the first slide I showed you. This is the same person, first individual. And I have to be honest, When I saw this slide, I was ecstatic. Let me look at Vivek's face right now. There's Vivek. I was ecstatic, Vivek. I thought, I'm going to show this slide in every grant application I have. Everybody's going to fund me. I am good, man. Okay. So now we got to do some truth in advertising. All of y'all know that AI, and this is an AI method, it can do, you really need to be skeptical. You need to not just, swallow things, right? And so the question is, are we really personalizing? Is this algorithm really detecting that when the person's engaged, it's better to send an activity suggestion? I thought, yes, man, it definitely is. The blue dots are almost always better than the high dots. They continue to be so. Life is really good. So what we've done is we've started developing these post-mortem analyses for these algorithms. And I'm going to show you one such post-mortem analysis on the next slide. What we do is the blue curve is the moderating effect of engagement. It's the actual data for that particular individual. And you see it starts off at 0 because this person's prior mean for the moderating effect of engagement was 0. And then it kind of varies. It is higher than 0 most of the time, as we saw on the prior slides. What are these black curves? There's 2,000 black curves. Each one represents a bootstrap version of this same individual, but under the ground truth that there is absolutely no moderating effect of engagement. No moderating effect at all. So each black curve is a simulated, this same individual simulated under the ground truth of in which there's no moderating effect of engagement. Notice that the blue curve, which is the real data for this person, is well within the mass of the black curves for quite some time. What does that tell me? That prior slide that looked so glorious, I thought it was just glorious, that's just not up to March through March, April, that's really just not enough evidence that engagement is moderating. Because when we go back, the blue curve, it could have easily happened under the ground truth of there being no moderating effect. Now, as we get into late May, June of 2020, the blue curve now drifts higher and higher above the black curves, indicating, yes, the algorithm has picked up something. There is indeed some evidence of really moderating effect. Because now the blue curve, it's not consistent with all the black curves, which were, the blue curves, the real data, the black curves are all bootstrap versions of the person under which there's no effect. So it helps me do a little bit more truth in advertising. Is this algorithm learning? Yes, I feel like it is, but it's not learning like ASAP, like I thought it was, which is very interesting. Okay, I want to give you some I just have 2 more slides, and they're related to some, what I think are really important take-home points. If you're, I'm particularly talking to my behavioral science collaborators or my human computer interaction collaborators. If you want to run one of these decision-making algorithms, a reinforcement learning algorithm or some sort of controller, or there's a whole bunch of different names for these decision-making algorithms, and you want to run it in your study, you need to think to yourself, do you want to use the data from your study after the study's over to conduct a wide variety of statistical analyses? Like you might have some other outcomes you care about, like a self-report of burden or a self-report of how engaged, how useful the individual thought the intervention was, and so on. Or like in the case of heart steps, we might have been interested in treatment effects on bouts of activity as opposed to 30-minute step count. You might be interested in conducting mediation analyses. Suppose you want to do that. You want to use this data to conduct these kind of analyses. Then you need to ask, is your algorithm, it doesn't have to be a reinforcement learning algorithm, any kind of decision learning algorithm, is it pooling data across users in order to learn in which state, what treatment to send? If it is, then the algorithm is creating dependency between your users. So since Walter asked me the last question, I'll pretend to say Walter and I are in the study. Walter at time T, say at time 30, is not very responsive on Saturday morning when the weather's good. That's going to influence me at time T+1 on Saturday morning when the weather's good, say. It'll influence whether or not I get a message, because the algorithm is going to pool Walter's prior data, my prior data, to decide whether or not to send a suggestion to me in the exact same context. So now Walter's, his whole set of data across time is now interrelated with my data, because his data was used to inform what treatments, when I got treatments, and my data in turn was used to inform when he would get treatment. So now you have this dependency, and this is not a terrible thing. It can be accommodated. This happens all the time, for example, in other areas of statistics, but you gotta know how you're gonna do it ahead of time. You don't just pretend like it's not there. Your users now, their data is dependent, and you need to be aware of that. And I have seen cases where the algorithm pooled data across users. The behavioral health science team was not aware of this. They used standard methods. And of course, their levels of confidence, their p-values, they're all off. Here's another one. Sometimes these algorithms, it doesn't have to be a reinforcement learning algorithm. It can be what people call controllers or other types of algorithms. They select the treatment deterministically. That is, given all the data, knowing all the data you have on that individual or other individuals up to that time, then the person definitely will get a particular type of treatment, or they might not get a treatment at all. That's deterministically. In Heart Steps, what we did was knowing all the data up to that time with a certain probability, the person would get a treatment. That's stochastically. If the algorithm starts to select treatments deterministically, you need to ask, and this is very, very common in with AI algorithms, decision-making algorithms, that they begin to select the treatments deterministically. Very common. You have to ask, what are the consequences of this for your statistical analyses of your data? Because once, if an algorithm with probability 1 always sends a message on Saturday morning when the weather's good, if something has changed, you can't discover that. You just can't, because you don't know what'll happen if you don't send the message. You just can't. So you want to be aware of this so that, you can do this, you can think to yourself, no matter what, these algorithms have two parts. They have a learning algorithm, they have a treatment selection strategy. And you can ask questions about this. What kind of learning algorithm are you using? Are you selecting your treatments? And you can probe on this to make sure that you understand what your engineering, computer science collaborators are planning. This is the end of my talk. Thanks for spending the time with me.
Thank you, Susan. Questions?
I have a question about the learning algorithm. I mean, I'm a little confused. Are you trying to fit one algorithm per patient, per participant?
It depends on the setting. In some studies, it just depends on who you're collaborating with. So like in Heart Steps, the algorithm was totally separate, one from the other. Everybody had their own algorithm. In Oralytics, Vivek's study, hey Vivek, I hope you realize this. We're pooling over everyone. So you have to think about it ahead of time. So for example, in Vivek's study, we have these adjustments to allow us to do all the after study analyses to make sure we get the right level of confidence, confidence intervals and so on. It really depends on who you're working with. And this is something you need to probe.
Okay. And my second question is like, I think you show the picture. How or when do you decide that your algorithm already done learning? Is
right.
Depending on the data, the amount of data, and also the trajectory?
Yeah, so I love this question. This is a great question. In my world, I'm a mHTI kind of person. I don't think life is so stationary. I don't think these algorithms can ever stop learning. It's too risky. Life is just not stationary. I'm not the same person 3 months from now. Something could happen. Take me, I broke my ankle. If I were on the heart steps thing, all of a sudden heart steps would start to notice that I'm only getting 100 steps per day. It should not be sending me suggestions. I'm not going to be very responsive. You know, that's non-stationarity. And the algorithm itself doesn't know I broke my ankle. I'd have to tell it some way. And the current version of Heart Steps doesn't permit that. So to me, the algorithm should never stop learning. It should always be tracking you. Things change. Maybe you're a young mother and your children now have started school, and all of a sudden you're going to be responsive in settings you were never responsive before, because before you had your children with you and you couldn't act on it. Now you don't, your children are at school, and you can actually act on these suggestions. So to me, these algorithms never stop learning. That's quite different. The mHTI way of thinking is quite different from the Jedi point of view, where the algorithm is just part of the experimental design. You just run the algorithm at the end of the study. You look at how the algorithm is making decisions, and the scientific team comes together and forms a Jedi. A very different way of thinking.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear about your current development. It's the first time I hear, something about artificial intelligence besides image reading.
Yeah, actually, like there's a lot of AI in the digital space, as you well know. For example, in Sense to Stop, there was an AI algorithm that detected whether or not the person was currently physiologically stressed. And then the reinforcement learning algorithm would take that detection as part of the person's state and decide whether or not to provide a suggestion, for example, a stress reduction, some sort of stress reduction support. So you can have algorithms all over the place.